That's a feeding relationship. What about non-feeding relationships, where one species does not eat another? Okay, and this particular relationship is different. Okay, I'm going to move this out of the way here. Okay, and now what we got are these different forms of what we call non-feeding relationships. And let me go through them in very simple terms. I'm not going to give you a full definition because I think what we can do is put this in very simple plus minus form. All right, let me start with amensalism. This is a rare form. You don't see it that often, but it's a relationship where you have two species interacting. And before I go on, I should also start off with this term called symbiotic. Okay, relationship. Symbiotic relationship just means a relationship or an interaction between two species. Two species interacting in a non-feeding way. So when you see the term symbiotic, just remember we're talking about, okay, two species interacting. And that symbiotic relationship can become in these 6 different forms. Okay, the first again is called amensalism, and with amensalism we are talking about a relationship between two organisms in which one is harmed, so I'm going to give it a minus, and the other one doesn't care. Give it a 0. So one of them's not harmed at all, and another one is harmed. A great example would be a tree, which a branch of the tree falls down on a bunny rabbit. All right, the bunny rabbit is harmed, so you get this negative, but the tree doesn't care about losing the branch. All right, it doesn't care, so therefore it's a neutral. Not a very common one, but one that you're going to have to know. Next one, commensalism, is more important and more common, and that's where one benefits, so we'll give it a plus. There's a benefit for a particular organization or organism, and the other one just doesn't care. Okay, so you might have, I don't know if you've ever seen those little fish that hang on to sharks. Okay, those particular fish that are on the bottom of the sharks, and again, I don't know if you've ever seen that. They're called remoras. Those particular fish feed off the shark and little organisms that are on the shark. So they benefit from that interaction between the shark and that little remora fish, but the shark doesn't get any benefit from it, and it doesn't get hurt by it. So it's called commensalism. Competition, on the other hand, is a little bit different. This is where both are harmed. Competition is very difficult for an organism because it's putting stress on an organism when it's competing with another particular organism or another particular species. All right, so you could have 2 different types of competition: intra and inter-specific. Okay, and both of these are specific. Whoops. If I can spell it right, let's try that again. That way you can see it a little bit better. Specific. It's just like interscholastic sports and intramurals. If it's an intra-specific, it's two individuals of the same species competing against each other. It could be, deer all competing for the food source. Okay, that's called intraspecific. Interspecific would be something like if you had a tree that had berries on it and you had 2 different species of birds trying to eat those berries. All right, it's between different species. Intra is within one species, inter is with several species. All right, let's go to the next one, mutualism. Mutualism, almost like what it sounds like, is where the interaction comes to play where both benefit. Plus plus. All right, and a great example. There's many, many examples of mutualism. It could be as simple as a symbiotic relationship in which a bee pollinates a flower, and in return, the flower gives the bee some food. So that's called a mutualistic relationship. They both benefit. All right, let's go on to the next one as we go through these very quickly. A parasite, which I think you know, is where the parasite itself benefits at the expense of the other particular species. Okay, so you can have things like leeches affecting us, where the leeches, or a mosquito. Okay, but more importantly, parasites come into play when we're talking about diseases and things like that cause illness within humans, where we are negatively affected, but the parasites obviously are benefiting. And then, of course, you have the saprophytes, which are the last. And a saprophyte is the same exact relationship where one benefits and the other one doesn't. But this is a little bit different. This is kind of cheating, because a saprophyte is when an organism or species obtains its nutrients from dead or decaying plants or animals. All right, so one benefits at the expense of a dead organism. All right, and that's called a saprophyte. And obviously, saprophytes include things like a fungus. Okay, if you're thinking along the same lines, you would sit there and say bacteria, things that decompose. Okay, that's a saprophyte. All right, so those are the non-feeding relationships, and how they work using symbols, I think, is the best way to do it. Okay, now as I get rid of all that, let's take a look at some examples. All right, so we got some pictures here. I think some of them we've already talked about, but let's look at the upper left, where you have a fungus on a pine cone, where that fungus is actually a saprophyte. It's a saprophytic relationship between the fungus and the pine cone. The fungus is taking over and getting nutrients out of a dead organism. Okay, so that's a very simple one. The upper right-hand corner, of course, you have the bee. Okay, and the bee and the flower, as I said before, is a mutualistic relationship. All right, not so obvious would be down in the lower left, where you have a bird on the top of a cow. And what's happening is the bird is basically picking insects off the cow. All right, so the question is, does the bird benefit? And you should be answering yourself, yes. Does the cow benefit? For the most part, I would say no. All right, it just has insects on it. You know, the bird's feeding, the cow doesn't get any benefit from it. So you're talking one benefits, the other one doesn't care. All right, and so you should go back and say that's commensalism. Now, if the organisms on that cow were things like parasites and ticks, and that's what that bird was eating, all right, where you have parasitic organisms on the cow, then you could say that it's actually a mutualistic relationship where they both benefit. So it all depends on the situation. And then in the lower right, the beautiful picture of a tree blocking the sun from a poor little sapling. And in that case, where you have shade, it's where the big tree, it's not being harmed by the other species at all. It's not benefiting from the other species, so it doesn't care, but it's harming the other species. That's amensalism. That poor sapling can't get sun. All right, so there you go. Hopefully that helps. Now, what do these three organisms have in common? You have the ant, you have the Cecropia tree, all right, and by the way, this is called a Cecropia tree, just so you know if you ever see it again. It's called a Cecropia tree. It's a very common tree in the rainforests. All right, and of course, at the bottom, you have a sloth. Well, let me show you how these three interact. Okay, the Cecropia tree, on its branches produces, and in its branches produces sugar. That sugar is a great food for the ants, who love to eat that sugar. So a Cecropia tree is going to be covered with these ants. And unfortunately, the problem with these ants for other species is that these ants are very aggressive and they have very, very sharp pinchers. So when another species goes onto this particular tree, let's say a bird lands on a branch, this ant will then attack that particular species immediately before it could do any damage to the tree. Let's say an insect comes that wants to eat the leaves on a cecropia tree. Not on a cecropia tree, because these ants will then go and attack anything that tries to touch that within just a few seconds. All right, and I've seen it happen when we're in the rainforest, so it's quite a sight. So that means that the cecropia tree benefits by having the ants on it, because the ants protect the tree. And at the same time, the ants benefit because they get the sugar from the tree. So the two benefit from each other, so we got a mutualistic relationship. See how that works? All right, so where does this guy come into play? Well, a sloth in this particular picture, you see the sloth, it looks cute, nice, okay, something that you would go and hug. But when you see a sloth in a cecropia tree, it doesn't quite look like this. In fact, a sloth in a cecropia tree looks more like this. What happens is a sloth grows algae within its fur. All right? Now, I just said that these ants will attack anything that's in a cecropia tree. Well, what happens is that algae that grows on a sloth actually repels these ants. So a sloth will go up into a cecropia tree. Its algae that's growing in the fur will repel the ants won't bother it, and that sloth can sit in that tree for as long as it wants and nothing will ever come to eat it or attack it. It's a perfect defense. So you have a relationship between the sloth and the ants that's a little bit different. Okay? The ants don't get any benefit from the sloth, but the sloth benefits greatly from the ants for protection. All right? And so what you got is a commensalistic relationship. So these three things all interact together in a rainforest to create a real good interaction. Real good example. Okay? All right, let's move on. This chart just shows you another way of looking at it. If you would like to put this down in your notes, pause, write it down if it helps, okay, and then continue on.